noted in the previous chapter, the Qur'an apparently intends to criticize and correct what it regards as a mistaken Christian view of the Christian's own principal scripture. What is more, by the time of its collection, and principally in criticism of the behavior of the people of the book in regard to their scriptures, the Qur'an is already speaking of the distortion and alteration of scriptural texts. This is to be found in the very passages, and then he quotes a whole bunch of passages, that in subsequent Islamic tradition will undergird the doctrine of the corruption of the earlier scriptures, a development that would effectively discount the testimonies drawn by Jews and Christians from their scriptures in behalf of the verisimilitude of their teachings. Now, when he says this is to be found in the very passages that in subsequent Islamic tradition, the passages he quotes in parenthesis, he puts, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah, 75 to 79, Surah Al-Imran, 78, Surah Al-Nisa, 46, Al-Maida, verses 12 to 19. So this is a really crucial point. I understand Griffiths to be saying that according to the Quran's own position, the revelation that God refers to in the Quran is that which was given to Jesus or Moses or Abraham. In the gospel sense, of course, Jesus received this gospel from God as revelation. This is distinctive from the Christian's own view, where you have, for example, the writings of Paul and other writers, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which scholars today believe are anonymous. We don't know who wrote them. They're different, and Christians see that as their scripture, but the Quran sees the scripture as that which was given to Jesus, in the same way that Muhammad received revelation, in the same way that Abraham or Moses received revelation, Jesus received revelation. So Griffiths is saying the Quran apparently intends to criticize and correct what it regards as a mistaken Christian view of the Christian's own scripture. So they misidentified it. They look to Paul in his letters, for example. They look to anonymous late first century biographies of Jesus as the gospel. But in fact, the correct focus should be on the scripture that Jesus received and Jesus preached. There are verses even in the Gospels the Christians have which portray Jesus, for example, in the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, where Jesus is portrayed as going out and preaching the gospel. The gospel that Jesus preached is not the gospel that Paul preached, and you can do a simple historical comparative analysis to demonstrate that. So the Quran is making a really quite radical claim, I think. I do recommend this book highly. It is a great work of scholarship, and he says a lot more about how the Quran understands the stories that the Bible also tells about the prophets and so on. And the Quran tells these stories in its own way as a corrective, so Griffith says, as a corrective to the tellings in the Bible of these same stories. So where the Bible that we have today would portray the prophets as often as evildoers, people who did terrible things, who committed adultery and so on, the Quran corrects that and gives the truth, if you like, of these people's lives. So it's retelling many of the same stories we see in the Bible, but in its own distinctive way, correcting the earlier account, albeit an account that has been corrupted by unknown Christians, I suppose, Christian scribes, Jewish scribes. So these are two representative scholars, and obviously you may disagree with what they say. You're free to do so. But I find their arguments persuasive. And I suppose a final point would be this. The Christian Bible today is very clear in the four Gospels and all apostles, in fact, the whole of the New Testament, that Jesus was crucified. I mean, that's the dominant theme, that, God willed his son, the Messiah, to die. The Quran, it seems to me, denies that. So it would be impossible, really, to believe that the Quran, which has such a familiarity with the stories of the prophets and Abraham and Moses and Jesus and so on, could not be aware that the New Testament says, as its one great statement, that Jesus was crucified. So in denying it, it really is in a very obvious, this is the elephant in the room, I think, that the Quran is obviously not endorsing the New Testament. It can't, because the central claim of the New Testament, that Jesus was crucified and rose again, is simply denied by the Quran. Because obviously if he didn't die, then he didn't rise again. So I don't think you really need to be a scholar to work this one out. Kind of basic logic would indicate that. And there we are. So I hope that